festival that was started in 2000 by anthropology teacher Mark Prentice, who is with us today. And it features speakers and events from across a wide range of different social science disciplines. This year's theme is Speaking Truth to Power. We currently live in very troubling times in terms of multiple wars with huge civilian death tolls, climate crisis, prejudice, inhumanity, and misinformation. We need to analyze and understand these issues and the possible solutions so we can find our voices to speak truth to power and make good choices as citizens of the world. I'm grateful for the help of my many Vanier colleagues and staff, and thank the VCSA especially for their generous support of today's keynote speaker, Gwynne Dyer. Please turn off your electronic devices, or at least turn the volume off, so that we will not be disturbed by them or by any chatter. Please be attentive until the end of the question and answer period. Thank you. So I acknowledge that the place in which I live and work is situated within the traditional unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. I honor and thank the traditional custodians of this land and strive to support Indigenous-led decolonization work. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Gwynne Dyer. I've actually been a great fan of Gwynne Dyer since I was a teenager, and remember watching the NFB series War, which came out in the early 1980s, which is 7 one-hour episodes filmed in 10 different countries. And one of those episodes was even nominated for an Academy Award. So he was a huge star already in the 1980s. And all of this made me profoundly interested in following current events and studying more about international relations, and inspired me to participate in many peace demonstrations when I was in my university years. So Gwynne Dyer had an impact on me, and I thank him very much for that. So Dr. Dyer is a Canadian journalist and military analyst who is best known for his many radio and television documentaries about war. He was born in Newfoundland and received degrees from Canadian, American, and British universities. He trained as a historian and served in the naval reserves of 3 countries and taught at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, and at Oxford University. He lives now in London, England. He just came into town on Sunday, so he's here to be with us, as well as to visit his son and grandchildren who live in Montreal. So Gwynne Dyer's columns have appeared in many papers around the world, and his program War was aired on television in 45 different countries. He has produced many other award-winning television and radio documentaries and has published 14 books, the latest of which is The Shortest History of War, From Hunter-Gatherers to Nuclear Superpowers, that came out just last year in 2022. So I know it was announced that Dr. Dyer will speak about the war in Ukraine. Of course, with all the things happening in the Middle East, he'll be willing to also speak about that a bit. And as I said, during the question and answer period, if you have particular questions, you can ask them. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Gwynne Dyer.
Thank you, Silke. I'm glad everybody knows I was big in the 80s. I'm fairly small in the 2020s, but we'll get on with it anyway. Feedback. I am still a journalist, and I even still go to the wars. And making sense of them is, I guess, my job, but it's very hard to make sense of a war. You can sort of analyze what the strategies are and so on, but beyond that, it gets a bit foggy. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is a couple of things in sort of sandwich form. I will talk about Ukraine. Not a great deal to be said there. I will talk about the problems in Gaza Strip in Israel at the moment and what the strategies are there, and that's pretty horrific. But I will talk about war as a phenomenon, because that's actually, all of these are subsets and examples of a much larger phenomenon which is as old, well, it's as old as humanity, and indeed older. So talking about that is the context in which we have to see this other stuff. Let me begin by saying something really good has happened about war, which is that we have had nuclear weapons for 77 years without using them again once. That's remarkable. We always used new weapons as soon as we got them. Cannons, machine guns. The Wright brothers flew the first plane in 1903, and by 1914 they were using them in war. String bags. The Americans got, but we collaborated, we, Canada, with them, got the nuclear weapons in the spring of 45 and dropped them on 2 Japanese cities in the late summer of 1945. But although tens of thousands of nuclear weapons have been made since, not one has been used in war. I would say that's an accomplishment. 77 years and counting. We're doing something different. Now, I understand why this has happened. It scared the thing out of us. I mean, and we're not talking about 1945-style nuclear weapons either anymore. They only kill the central parts of one city. Hydrogen bombs are far more impressive. Nuclear winter, which is a consequence of dropping nuclear weapons on cities, is actually a continent killer, possibly a hemisphere killer. So we are duly frightened of these things, and so we should be, but it has had the useful effect of persuading everybody that they mustn't use them. Hence the whole theory of deterrence, which explains why we have them but don't ever think of using them. They are only there to stop other people from using them on us. That is not the usual role of any weapon. This is different. And it is a step towards rationality, at least, and a significant display of patience. And by the way, one of the ways that the nuclear powers, there's now 9 or 10 of them, depending on whether you think Israel has any nuclear weapons or not, so 10. The thing about them which is really quite striking is that with very few exceptions, none of them great powers, no country with nuclear weapons even allows itself to fight another country with nuclear weapons in a conventional war. You will observe that right now, NATO, the alliance we belong to, does not have any troops in Ukraine. The Russians are in Ukraine, so we will send arms to the Ukrainians, we will send money to the Ukrainians, but under absolutely no circumstances will NATO soldiers put boots on the ground in Ukraine, because they might end up killing Russian soldiers, and nobody wants to find out what happens next then. So, there is a level of rationality which, while not exactly shining, is significantly better than it used to be at the strategic level. That said, wars continue. And most wars these days are relatively low level compared to the great slaughter fests of the first half of the 20th century. It's quite striking. we were working our way up. The Napoleonic Wars killed 4 million people. In 20 years, the First World War killed about 11 million people in 4 years, and the Second World War killed 50 million people in 6 years. So we were obviously heading for the prize, but after 1945, we actually turned around and went the other way. The proportion of people killed in war, even counting civil wars and things like that, which I wasn't in the previous comments, even counting civil wars, the things people killed in military violence has dropped consistently every decade and is now running at approximately 1/50th of the level it was at as recently as 1950. It's extraordinary. Now, we are probably going to break that pattern this year and next. But by and large, there has been a significant, steady fall in the number of people killed in wars. Of course, you never will learn anything about this. I'm in the media. I know how this beast works. We will never, there's never a blank page in the paper because there's not enough news. We'll always find something to put on that page. Similarly, there will always be enough violence to get your attention in the world, and count on it, however obscure the place where it's happening. If there's nothing bigger happening, it will be on the page. So, there's no intuitive way just by looking at the news that you're going to judge what the level of violence in the world is. It's very low. I mean, even now with Ukraine and with Israel in the recent days, the level of violence in the world is extremely low. At every level, I should add. I mean, I saw violence every day when I was a kid. Now I only see it on television. So, there are things we say that aren't actually true. And about, chronic violence always at a high level, it's not true. But there's a lot of it about nevertheless. So, let me walk you through one war now, and I'll walk you through the Ukraine war. And then I'll walk you through one at the end, and we can talk about that, just so you get a sense of how people think about war when they're doing it, particularly the professionals. And in between, I'll try to tell you something about where all this comes from and why it might be changed. So, to begin with, Ukraine is now coming up to a year and 3/4 of war. February of 2001, February of 2002 is when Mr. Putin invaded. It was, from a military point of view, disgracefully poorly planned. It was clearly the boss telling people to do it, and not listening to people saying, military people saying, you can't get away with trying to do that. You don't have enough troops in the right places. I mean, that's the problem with one-person regimes. You can't convince them that they're wrong and that you are right, you the professional. So the invasion of Ukraine could only have succeeded if all the Ukrainians ran away, basically. Anything else was going to lead to the failure of the Russian invasion. I'm not disparaging what the Ukrainians accomplished, but there just weren't enough Russian troops on the roads to take Ukraine. It's a big country. And so it has descended since then into what is essentially static warfare with occasional punch. There is some truth in the line you often hear that it resembles the First World War. Trench lines, very little movement. The Ukrainians did quite well for a while with sudden dashes and grabbing chunks of territory. I'm afraid that's over. The mines and the minefields and the barbed wire and the emplaced artillery and so on mean that it takes a very long time to make to get way through. Water. A man needs water. And so now you have, with Ukraine, what is essentially an endurance contest. Can you dial the sound up, because I'm going to drop my voice down, otherwise we're going to be sign language here shortly. That's better. The Ukrainians can hang on for a long time because we're sending them weapons and we're sending them money, but they are losing people and they are outnumbered about 3-1. The glorious offensive that was going to push the Russians back has stalled. It really has stalled. I mean, they got a breakthrough, but they'd already committed all their troops, so they couldn't exploit it. And the consequence may well be, disagreeably, a negotiated and to some extent imposed on Ukraine peace settlement, which may or may not be lasting. I mean, Mr. Putin unleashed things that will not go quietly. The whole area is going to be quite fraught for a while. Ukraine, I don't think, will be able to push the Russians all the way out, and something will have to happen in Moscow before Mr. Putin will yield and make a deal that the Ukrainians could accept. So we'll have to wait a while, and people will be dying all the while we wait. This is familiar in wars. It's not the first time. He is, however, and I will return to this, but let me make the point right now. Mr. Putin is a war criminal. He's a war criminal not because I don't like what he did. He's a war criminal because an international court has said he is a war criminal. And that means there is a body of international law which can now designate people as war criminals. That's new. And it's real enough that Putin did not fly to South Africa a month and a half ago in order to address the conference of the G, whatever it is, 22, or I mean, you know, basically the Global South in Congress. He did it on video because he would have been arrested had he gone to South Africa, which had a legal obligation to arrest somebody who had been indicted by the court. So something has changed compared to the wars of the past, or even the period in the middle of the 20th century when we started doing this sort of trying to make some kind of international rules. Putin can go virtually nowhere because he'd be arrested. And it's not optional for the government who would arrest him either. If he's on their territory, they have to arrest him. They have a legal duty. So interesting things are happening, even though I can't say the sun is shining everywhere. But let me now just talk about why we do this thing. There's lots of social scientists in this room, and some of them have probably played with parts of this, I'm sure. I understand why they don't try to join it all up, because your colleagues will torpedo you at once if you go an inch beyond the available indisputable evidence, but I'm going to go a good deal further than that. The traditional view was that warfare was an invention of human beings. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the noble savage, before civilization, we lived in peace and harmony and equality. Savage not used in a contemptuous way here, but rather an admiring way. The noble savage was his, the ideal from whose level we have fallen by inventing civilization. So it's all our fault, and we invented, or God invented for us to punish us, war. And although that clearly sounded a little bit like a bedtime story, that was the story for a very long time. At least in the sense that people assumed that war was something that came with civilization. You know, they started living in towns, and by God, 3 decades or 3 centuries later, every town has got a wall around it. They're fighting wars. We know that from 5 or 5,500 years ago in the Middle East. And that view of where did war come from basically stood unchallenged until after the Second World War. There was a few people, individuals, questioning it, but there's no academic body of evidence to support a questioning. And then we had a bunch of early anthropologists who actually did something unprecedented. They went and lived with the people whose history they were trying to elicit. I mean, the genuine hunter-gatherers, pre-civilized human beings, quickly vanished when they came into contact with civilization. So there was, sort of large civilizations which quickly subdued and exploited them. So there was only a relatively short blink of time when people from those civilized societies could observe the original hunter-gatherer society before it vanished. But it was done in the 50s and 60s of the last century a number of times. In Alaska with the Inuit, in the Amazon with the Yanomamo, in Namibia with the San Bushmen, and a couple of other places in northern Australia and Queensland with the Aborigines, Australian Aborigines, trying to figure out how they really lived in the present, but also in the past. And of course, there was no writing, but societies without writing have very good memories of things like genealogy. So you could ask the Aborigines in Queensland, for example, how did your parents die? How did your grandparents die? How did your great-grandparents die? And you can go back 4 or 5 generations in their memories, and it turns out that 30% of the males died in war. Whoops. And there were some places, as with the Yanomamo in the upper Amazon, it was sort of the Rio Negro, the northern branch, who actually were still living in not exactly a hunter-gatherer life. They were what they call horticulturalists. They did slash and burn farming, but other than that, they were the genuine article, living in societies of about 100 people, bands of 100 people each one all at war with all the others, and the same statistic. Can't remember now the name of the anthropologist who did that one, but he came back with the number of about 30% of the adult males and 5% of the adult females died in war every generation. The females of the losing side not being safe and happy, but simply enslaved. Well, sexually enslaved, not working in the fields. So all of a sudden we have a much longer past in which we have been fighting wars. We didn't invent this with civilization. We adapted it, we expanded it, but we didn't invent it. It was already there. Fast forward another 10 years, and a woman called Jane Goodall, whose name you may well recall, one of Leakey's so-called angels. This was an anthropologist who had discovered that young women were less upsetting to chimpanzees who were observing them than young men. And so all of his students were women who were basically working on degrees, but they were living in camps observing chimpanzees, our nearest primate relatives. 98% shared DNA between humans and chimpanzees. And she was the one who hit the jackpot, although there was a number of others who did very useful work as well. she observed after about 2 years living with this band in a place called Gombe, and chimpanzees have relatively small territories. They have a territory, they defend it. It tends to be not much more than 2 or 3 kilometers in radius. But they fight wars. Chimpanzees fight wars. And she observed this. And of course, they're not exactly like human wars, because human beings, for at least millions of years, have been able to kill any beast, however large. Whereas chimpanzees actually do hunt and catch monkeys, things like that, but they never take on big game, and they don't actually have the ability to kill each other very well, not one-on-one. So chimpanzee warfare is always a matter of ambushes, where a group of males from one band spots a single male from another band and beats him to death, basically, with stones and bites and so on. But it happens again, and you know, so a whole lot of people started studying this, and you know what? They came up with the same ratio. About 30% of adult males die in these chimpanzee wars in every generation. Something's going on here, isn't it? We are dealing with a phenomenon. Now, interestingly, and here is the clue, it's all predators who are doing this, of course. You've got to be a predator to know how to kill at all. But it's group living predators who are fighting the wars, living in bands. So lions do this, but tigers who live alone don't. A single animal living alone taking on another animal of the same species has got about a 50% chance of dying. Nothing's worth that. If you live in a group and once in a while your group will encounter one member of another group, you have a very good chance of killing that one. So it's group living animals. Now what's the logic behind this in evolutionary terms? A good guess, and it's all I can offer you, is that the world has never been empty. It's always been full to capacity. And so animals tend to breed up to the carrying capacity of their territory, or a little above it. And once in a while, maybe once in a long while if you're lucky, something goes wrong. The weather changes, the migration routes shift, you don't have enough food in your territory, and somebody isn't going to make it of the several bands around yours. At that point, the survival strategy that works is go for broke and take their territory too, and you survive. And it doesn't have to happen very often, because every time it does happen, the group that survives is the one that's more ready to be aggressive enough to wipe out the other band. So over 40 or 50 generations, you have bred a more aggressive bunch of chimpanzees or human beings. That's what we're dealing with here. It's not the original sin. It's the usual workings of evolution. And it's not hard and fast, you've got to do this, but that's the default behavior in your species. And I think what happened with the rise of civilization is we just went on behaving the same way we had before, but we had much greater capability to do harm and good for ourselves. And you know, it didn't entrench itself. It was already entrenched, but it mutated into the kind of war we have fought for the last millions of years, we and our immediate ancestors. Doesn't mean we can't ever change. It means you're dealing with a phenomenon that is way beyond who's to blame in Israel. So that's sort of my working explanation for what's going on here. As a military historian, I can tell you all about the strategies, and I can tell you what people think the causes are. But quite often, there's a story that comes out of the Yanomamo. The guy who was doing the study, do you remember who it was? No, okay. The guy who was doing the study, he was an American guy, Napoleon something or other, he had a very French name, did ask the Yanomamo why they were always at war with the neighbors. And the Yanomamo said, women. And I'm sure they thought it was. And there's always a sort of casus belli, you know, there's always a specific reason why this war is necessary, but it's not the reason wars are happening. It's the way we deal with conflicts and conflicts of interest. So you got to address that level as well. And I'm not quite sure how you go at it, but you should start by recognizing it's there. So that, you know, I'm on thin ice here, but I'll say it anyway. What is happening in Israel now is, in one sense, the strategies of Hamas and the strategies of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. At a very different level, it's how both of these groups deal with conflicts of interest. And it is a behavior that is older than human beings. So, if that's an accurate analysis, are we doomed? And I don't think so, because we're an extraordinarily malleable species. We have changed in extraordinary ways. Well, one, obviously, is that we lived in groups of no more than 150 ever. Anything over 100 is almost certain to fission within the next generation. And the two groups would become enemies. There is, by the way, an excellent four-part thing on Netflix right now called Chimp Empire, which actually documents that happening in a group of chimpanzees. It's well worth a watch, and not just from an academic point of view. But we have learned to live in societies of, in this case, 40 million people. In China's case, 1.5 billion, to cooperate, to live more or less in peace. That is a rather startling transformation, would you not say? For a species that lived most of its history, 99% of it, 98% of it, in groups of no more than 150. So don't despair, you know, we can change. We've changed in many other ways as well, some of them more recent. For example, slavery was virtually universal in all of the classic societies, in every continent, and still in most societies in the 16th and 17th centuries. I mean, Europeans, Africans, Asians, and in fact the native people in the larger civilized societies that had, you know, sort of could exploit their labor, South and North America too. Slaves everywhere. It's gone, or almost gone. Everywhere in what, 200 years? Status of women? The last 50 years you've seen a little bit of change. But, you know, we can change. We are actually very malleable. When we put our minds to it, we can redesign ourselves. So that, I think, how am I doing on time here? I should be around 50 minutes. It's 3:09 now. 3:09. Hey, you noticed? Pretty good, eh? I will sort of stop in a minute, but I'll bring you up to speed. I don't want to trudge through 5,000 years of military history, and neither do you. What I can say is that it is essentially infinitely repetitious history with slightly better weapons changing over time. The empires expand, they shrink and disappear, you know, sort of running down a window pane. It means nothing, although a great many people work to build these empires and they all fail in the end. And wars, of course. But I can give you a date when something important happened, which was war ceased to be glorious, and I would say it was the 1st of July, 1916, I beg your pardon. 1st of July, 1916, the Battle of the Somme. That, as close as I can reckon it, is when we decided collectively as a society that war is not glorious, it's not a good thing, it's a bad thing and a shameful thing. Well, we're not there yet, but no human group on earth today would agree with the proposition that war is a glorious thing. That's a start. And so through the terrible wars of the 20th century, and then in a way retreating in the face of the reality that these wars are unwinnable and unsurvivable, and the decline in the death rate of wars that has been persistent since the 1950s. And I mean, the decline is from tens of millions to tens of thousands, or at least hundreds of thousands and low hundreds of thousands of people being killed a year in war. With always, of course, the possibility of a massive mistake and nuclear war, because it's not, it's not off the books, it's just under control at the moment, and hopefully for the long term. But we have begun to build structures like the one I referenced, Mr. Putin in the International Criminal Court, but even the United Nations itself was directly created as an instrument to stop wars between states. It's what the Security Council is about. The fact that it doesn't work very well should not be allowed to obscure the fact that it was created, which was astounding. No previous generation would have believed it possible. So I guess I promised you, just as a downer, don't want to leave you on a high, I promised you an analysis of the strategy. And the right question to ask is always, what was the strategy? What did the players want to accomplish by the actions they took? So let us start with, in Israel, or in the Gaza Strip rather, Hamas, the local ruler and sort of standard bearer for one version of Palestinian nationalism. What did they hope to accomplish when they broke through the fence and sent out about 1,000, 2,000 of their best fighters to kill sleeping civilians? As horribly as possible. I do not believe that those young men sort of hacked the heads off of babies because that's what they were brought up to do. They were under orders to do it with the maximum horror, because I think almost everybody who knows the situation would agree, Hamas was not seeking a military win. They know a military win is not possible. They cannot defeat the Israeli army. They cannot drive the Jews into the sea or whatever other fantasy people indulge in. They were trying for a specific response from the Israelis, which was that the Israelis would invade the Gaza Strip. Because they had quite a good time the last time the Israelis invaded the Gaza Strip on the ground. They killed a lot of Israelis, and the Israelis had to go home without accomplishing any of their purposes. And at the moment, they really needed to stop the Israelis from succeeding, because Israel was about to make a deal with Saudi Arabia, which would have sidelined the Palestinians entirely. So we need a big war in which the Israelis kill a lot of Palestinians. The Hamas purpose was to cause the Israelis to slaughter large enough numbers of Palestinians to call the whole Middle East joining up but neglecting the Palestinians, to call that to a halt. That is actually the way that, I don't call them terrorists, they are, but that guerrilla organizations of any sort always have strategies like that. They don't have military strategies, they have political strategies that are carried out with some weapons. So there's the Hamas strategy: commit enough horrible crimes that the Israelis send their troops in and kill a very large number of Palestinians, which will bring all that talk about an Israeli-Saudi détente to a halt, put us back on the map as the toughest and most boldest leader of the Palestinians. You know, I mean, that one, it didn't take you 3 seconds to figure that out. Now what is the Israeli response? Well, the Israeli response is actually reasonably intelligent. They know into the trap that the Hamas people have laid, and that's why you see this weird business going on of clearing the civilians out of northern Gaza so that they can go into a free fire zone and take down as many of the Hamas fighters as possible with as little exposure of their own infantry. They can use massive bombing and so on, because the civilians have allegedly gone south of the Wadi Gaza. Okay, that's the Israeli response, which we see playing out now. I don't believe, by the way, it will work, but that's what I see them trying. What does Hamas do? It tells the Palestinians to stay in the north of Gaza. Don't go. Because if they stay there, they will get killed in large numbers, which, remember, was the whole point of the exercise in the first place. There's nobody free of sin here. And all of these stratagems probably won't shift the strategic balance a single meter. But that's, you know, wars are very easy to start. Well, not very easy, but easier to start by far than they are to stop. And people do not regard past losses as sunk costs and walk away from them. People want recompense, want revenge, want to balance the books, which you can never do when you're talking about lives, but that's the way people think because we're people. So I don't offer you a great hope of this being somehow the final round between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think the Hamas people have probably managed to destroy the likelihood in any near future of an Israeli peace treaty with Saudi Arabia. They haven't managed to destroy and won't manage to destroy the Israeli peace treaty with Egypt, which is another reason that the Israelis are being very careful not, I mean, there's a lot of talk now about they want to push all the Palestinians out, second Nakba. Come on. The only way you can push them out is through Egypt. Your most important peace treaty is with Egypt. If Israel didn't have a peace treaty with Egypt, it would have a real military problem on its hands. The other Arab countries, not so. So they're not going to get rid of these. I mean, there's nowhere to put them except in Egypt, and Egypt, your ally. They don't want them. So this is only round 3A or 14B, depending on how you're counting. Have I depressed you now? Okay. That's about right. Thank you very much. Questions and comments, I think.
Question? I can bring the mic to you. Put your hand up if you have a question.
So you said earlier that you believed the reason Putin invaded Ukraine was, I don't know, due to just Thinking it was just great, sort of, just thinking he could do it, not believing his generals and intelligence services?
I think that he was personally into a legacy building mode. You know, he just turned 70, and he thought that the destruction of the Soviet Union, or at least the Slavic speaking parts of it, was a historical tragedy, and his gift to Russia would be to put it back together. And then he persuaded himself that he could do that quickly with an invasion.
It's like not so much as like an intelligence failure, like.
The intelligence was there. I mean, the Americans were. Oh, you mean on the Russian side?
Yeah, on the Russian side.
I think that everybody in the GRU and the FSB and the various Russian intelligence agencies knew perfectly well this was a dumb idea. But it's not the sort of system where you can tell the boss he's crazy. And there was all sorts of efforts to find somebody who could talk to Putin, who could pass that message. But since the messengers tend to get shot, there's not a lot of volunteers for that role. And I don't doubt that there were some people in the regime, ambitious people, who thought, well, why not let him do it? It'll fail, and he'll be gone, and maybe I'm it. There's always people playing games.
Any other questions?
What would you say to the idea that religion is one of the main causes of most wars, if not only now, but like in the entire existence of human civilization?
Well, religion certainly is a permanent companion to human civilization. It's one of the ways that you even held the little bands together. It was the most important way of holding large numbers of people together when we were originally starting to live in large numbers, because it provides some sort of extra human authority to what the people who are in power but are not extra human are trying to do. But as far as religion being the cause of most wars, first of all, religion is mobilized in most wars, but it doesn't mean it's the cause. Moreover, most religions have senior people in charge who are not alien from the political hierarchy. They're somewhere like that in most countries. There are some that is not true. There's vestiges of us in things like this country having a queen, and it is to the queen that people swear their loyalty, soldiers. But once upon a time it actually meant that, and Christianity was the official religion and so on. Well, that's all gone, and I don't terribly miss it. But over the long history, I would say in most wars, religion was a tool rather than a cause. The causes are individual or collective ambition. They are economic causes very often, but again, individual ambition being linked with that. And then religion providing justification of a divine order and solidarity and so on. The religions are always, one of the things I love about human beings is that everybody knows there are many religions, and the one you believe tends not to be the one you found by searching it out, but the one you were born into. And all the others are false, which means that no matter what you believe, 90% of the people in this room don't agree with you, and yet you're confident in what you believe on divine authority. So, if that's the way religion works, it is great for keeping groups together who already share that religion, not so great for larger cohesion of societies that are not following a single religion. And actually over history, it being mostly an imperial history, most societies have included several religions. Maybe one in a dominant position and others in a subordinate positions, but that's the way it worked.
How did the Battle of Somme change your perspective on war? How is it so significant?
I missed the key word. How did what change?
Battle of Somme, how did it change your perspective in 1916 on war?
I'm sorry, I'm still missing the key word.
Battle of Somme. I don't know how
Battle.
it's spelled in English, sorry.
Sorry, no, I'm sorry. I'm not being abusive. I just didn't get the word.
You
It
were
is
talking
battle, is it?
about July 1st, 1916, right?
Yeah. How did that battle?
How
I
did
wasn't
that
there
battle change your
personally. How
perspective?
did it happen? Well, basically, until that date or thereabouts, the reality of war, which is young men dying for no good reason, in pain and usually alone, is disguised by a whole mythology of glory and, you know, they're not dead, they're fallen, right? They're not dead, lying in the ground, going to rot. No, they're fallen. And that's okay. That's almost sacred. And yet, of course, what was happening was frightened young men being torn to pieces by artillery and being dead forever. And their families in mourning. And there's no upside. And we managed for a very long time to ignore that fact because battles were fought a long way away from the civilian population, generally. And you'd prefer it that way because if they were being fought in your neighborhood, you were being looted, if not raped and killed. So, but you didn't see what was happening. First of all, mostly before the 20th century, the armies were made up mainly of people who were professionals and not terribly attractive in the professions they had previously been in, like, you know, drunkard or thief or something. They're men on the run. Now you've got, with mass armies, young men who are somebody's children and known to them and loved. And when they start dying in large numbers, it's quite different. When the images come home as well, and we're not talking about very powerful mass media yet, but they're powerful enough to convey the reality of the battlefield to people at home, they are revulsed by it. I mean, it's ghastly what's happening, and they can see only a corner of it, but it's enough to appall them. I think that's what did the trick. And it did it everywhere. I mean, it will take a long time for a value system and a perspective as deeply entrenched as the old war is glorious perspective to fade away completely. But I can see it fading. It is very much weaker than it used to be. There are some societies where information is very closely controlled, North Korea, for example, where that probably hasn't occurred at all yet. But it is occurring more and more. I mean, as recently as the Second World War, there was a massive controversy in the United States when Life magazine showed a picture of dead American Marines in the sand on a beach on some Pacific island. They had to recall the copies that had the picture in it because it caused such horror among the audience at home in the United States. You know, dead bodies lying, nobody caring for them. They're busy fighting a war on a beach, who are our kids. You know, so if you want to go on fighting wars, you've got to keep as much as possible of that information out of the hands of the general public. And I would say even in the First World War, that phenomenon was happening. Did you know that almost every army in the First World War mutinied in 1917 or 1918? French army mutinied, Russian army mutinied, German army mutinied, British army came close to mutiny. I mean, things were falling apart. They just couldn't stand it. So there is progress.
Okay.
Do you think the pandemic played a role on the rising conflicts that are going through this early stage of the 2020s?
Could you repeat it? I'm sorry. I'm not getting this question, but it's not your fault. Oh, the pandemic. Oh, okay. Again, I missed the word. No. No, I don't think so. The pandemic greatly inconvenienced civilians. But the war is generally regarded by those who do it as more important than mere illness in the soldiers. The whole perspective changes. If you're dealing with people whom you are ordering to expose themselves to death by violence, you're not really worried about the COVID except as it affects operational efficiency, which of course to some extent it does. But no, you're dealing with different military people in war have a very ruthless, functional perspective on life and death. They understand that to accomplish the orders, some of your people will have to die. They don't imagine it can be done without them dying. I can remember the American fellow, a writer later, but he'd served as an infantry officer in France in the Second World War. And he talked about the men in his company and how you love them, but you have to use them up to accomplish the purposes of the state. This guy was clearly an intellectual. Just look at the words he's using, but he was in tears as he said it. And yet he did it. He did use them up. So if that's your perspective on the prospects of a society which is at war, and okay, so or might be at war, and we've got a disease running wild. No, it's not going to influence the decisions that are made, not in a big way.
Any other questions?
You were talking before that despite the Russian army being unprepared for the invasion of Ukraine, that Ukraine would eventually sue for peace with Russia due to a lack of manpower.
Yeah.
But we also, or at least I do, I see on the news and online that Russian forces are slowly running out of supplies like tanks and ammunition. So I was wondering that with shipments of NATO supplies like vehicles and tanks, that if this would be able to actually change the tide of the war or affect the outcome.
I can't say no, and I would like to see the Ukrainians succeed. I mean, I'm against all wars, but once it's started, I do have preferences as to who wins, you know? And this is clearly a case of naked aggression by the Russians under a deluded leader, and that should not be rewarded. But the willingness of Western publics to go on supporting the Ukrainians, there's a selfish version of it. I mean, it's our money that's getting spent in Ukraine. And there is a sort of attention span problem. You know, I'm willing to worry about this for 2 years, but now listen, I've got lots of other things to worry about. Could we put a lid on that one? That sort of thinking, I'm afraid, is common. If the Ukrainians cannot deliver a convincing success militarily through this winter, and the fighting won't really stop in the winter. It may slow down a bit, but it won't stop. It didn't even stop last winter. Then at some point in the spring, you will see, spring or summer, a last Ukrainian gamble, because they've got to get some sort of success, and if that fails, they're going to have to make a deal. And there are various deals to be made. Some of them are not horrifying. The one that I think would cause the least anguish all round is for the borders to go back to where they were in 2014, which means that the original aggressions of 2014 are in a way accepted, or at least they stay with Russia, but the further territories that it conquered in the first attacks last, almost 2 years ago, will have to go back to Ukraine. Something of that sort, if everybody's fed up and wants to go home. But I'm afraid you somehow have to shuffle Putin aside to get to that point. If magically the Russians collapse, and as I just said in response to another question, armies do collapse. They are always very fragile because you're asking people to do insanely dangerous things. And, you know, it's the only lives they've got. So persuading them to do these insanely dangerous things while they watch people pay the price for beside them of doing these dangerous things is a difficult activity. And of course, the armies have had many, many centuries to work out how to motivate people and keep them from running away or quitting or hiding or something. But even then, it's a daily task to keep the soldiers there. You know, why would you? It's your only life. How could it be worse than this? So armies do collapse and just give up and walk away or run away. It doesn't always happen. It doesn't necessarily happen with the Russians more than with anybody else. It has happened to almost everybody at one time or another. So I'm not saying it has to happen this way, end this way. I'm saying it's beginning to look like it will end something like this way. And I wasn't saying that even 2 months ago. But you have to keep up, you know?
So we have time for one more question, if anyone has one.
Considering that Considering that Israel has one of the best and most sophisticated intelligence agencies in the world, was the attack of Hamas really a surprise for them?
Yeah, I think it was a surprise to them, which is, of course, not entirely to their credit. I mean, what they had done, it seems to me, was to persuade themselves of one picture in which Israel had successively, you see, Netanyahu was subsidizing Hamas. Indirectly, he was providing work for people to go into Israel to earn money from the Gaza Strip. And of course, Hamas was taxing that money. So Hamas was actually, Netanyahu was backing Hamas within the Gaza Strip because he regarded the people in the West Bank as the ones he wanted to drive out of the country. He never wanted to do Nakba to on the Gaza Strip. Who wants the damn Gaza Strip? He wanted the West Bank. And so keeping the Palestinians divided between Hamas in Gaza Strip and the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, in the West Bank was his highest aim. And he was playing with Hamas. The military knew that. And they believed his story that he had basically bought Hamas up. They will play along. I've got a deal. The money's flowing that way. We're going to concentrate on the West Bank. Really promising the Palestinians there are going to give us an excuse to drive them out one of these days, and that's the territory we want. Israeli intelligence, military intelligence, whether they believed that was a good idea or not a good idea, knew it was the operational idea. So they're not going to challenge the idea that Hamas is playing this game. They are making their analysis on the assumption that Hamas has made a deal with Netanyahu where they will get, enough money to keep them in power there and keep the Palestinians divided so that he can concentrate in the West Bank. Now, why he would believe that was a deal Hamas would make, they pretended to make it, but I don't think they ever did really. And Netanyahu, he is infinitely resourceful in plotting, but I don't think he's a very clever man. And so they framed everything in whatever they saw. And they saw most things. They saw people practicing landings on the coast, Hamas people. They saw Hamas people in paragliders flying around. But they explained it because they had this frame of reference where we've done a deal with Hamas and we're keeping Hamas in power and we are discrediting the people in the West Bank, Fatah, and the Palestinian Authority. Therefore, all of this stuff that we see happening in the Gaza Strip, the paragliders and the landing craft and the rockets and so on, is just Hamas making a show of being in conflict with us, whereas really we've made a deal. It's self-deception, delusion, but it's not uncommon. I mean, these are smart people, but if they frame a thing a certain way, all the evidence that's coming in that should say we are going to be attacked instead says they're pretty good at fooling their own people into thinking they're our enemy. I've had quite a lot to do with the IDF as a journalist, and I have quite a high opinion of their competence in general. But a lot of heads will roll in Israeli intelligence after this one. They got it desperately wrong.
Thank you so much for being here.